Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, recent violations against Palestinian journalists have media groups concerned about freedom of speech in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. But first, we head to Venezuela, where the installation of the all-powerful Constituent Assembly has been delayed to Friday. We're joined now by Al Jazeera's John Holman, who's in Caracas. Thanks for being with us today. Now, today was supposed to be a day of mass protests, marches in the streets of the capital, but the streets are relatively quiet. What happened?
Well, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game, really, between the government and between the opposition, because the opposition keeps scheduling their protests for when they think the Constituent Assembly, this, as you said, all-powerful body that will hold precedence over the National Congress, which is opposition-dominated for one, they keep trying to hold their protest for when it gets inaugurated, and the government keeps pushing that back from Wednesday to Thursday until Friday. So the opposition have to push their march back as well. So that's what's been happening. That's why the streets are relatively quiet. It's still the calm before the storm here.
So I pulled up one of your tweets just from a little bit earlier on my screen here. Inauguration of Constituent Assembly now postponed till Friday, as you mentioned, after the private press was invited and then removed from the swearing in. It seems like there's a bit of confusion around this. Why is that?
We still don't know, actually. Our team went down there to try and film the swearing in, as you say, of the members of the Constituent Assembly, and we had an emailed invitation to do that together with the rest of the press. Everyone was waiting there, and then they were politely sort of ushered out and told that it would be a private event. Then there wasn't a swearing in. There was just a sort of meeting of the different members, and we're told they're going to be sworn in as day goes on. Now, who knows if that had something to do with the fact that the voting process for this Constituent Assembly was openly called into doubt. The opposition had already decided not to participate in the vote to put forward members for the Constituent Assembly because they said that basically it was rigged against them from the start. But then the voting process did happen. The government said that 8 million people had turned out to vote, and then the company that makes the actual voting machines and has done for more than a decade for governmental elections here came out and said, well, we think that the total has been, or we know, they said that the total's been inflated by more than 1 million people. They've always supported the government in terms of elections in the past, so it caused quite a shock yesterday. President Maduro came out after that and called the CEO of the company stupid. So that was a real kerfuffle yesterday in terms of the vote and what went on. That might have affected the timings for the Constituent Assembly itself. And
I pulled up a headline here just referencing what you mentioned there about Maduro and what he thought of those claims. This is from The Guardian. Venezuela president says U.S. pressured Smartmatic, that's the name of the company, to make the turnout claim. So that's in addition to it being stupid, as John mentioned. But I want to turn to these tweets we got from members of our community. This is in Venezuela, their blog. They write, if Constituent Assembly convenes, everything is on the table. The human rights abuses we have seen so far will pale in comparison to what is likely coming. More brazen persecution, purging of dissident voices, and cancellation of future elections. I know you've been speaking to people really on both sides who are supporters and critics of the government. What are you hearing? Is it similar to this tweet?
Well, I think maybe what's most relevant, we just spoke to the communications minister of Venezuela, and I brought up when I spoke to him exactly what you've just been talking about, precisely that protesters have been taken, more than 500 of them, according to Foro Penal, which is a group of lawyers who formed an NGO trying to deal with these sorts of cases. They say that more than 500 protesters have been taken to military courts instead of civilian courts. So I spoke to the communications minister just a couple of hours ago, and he said that that's traditional in Venezuela when soldiers, when military personnel have been accused of civilian crimes, they're taken to civilian courts, and vice versa. When civilians are accused of military crimes, they're taken to military courts. That didn't quite square with what the head of the Foro Penal told us. He said that wasn't traditional, and he also said that these are sometimes people that haven't been involved in armed insurrection, which is really when people can be taken to military courts. These have been women that have been providing food for protesters, women that have been reciting the rosary, the Catholic sort of prayer over protesters. So there does seem already to be real worries about the ways that protesters are being tried in Venezuela, where they've been taken to and where they've been taken to prison. So that's from the communications minister. We've also been talking, obviously, to people at street level, as you say, supporters of the government. We went to a rally the other day, a lady in the street, she had a stall, and she said, listen, the government have given me an apartment, the government have given me a pension,
right.
The government have really allowed me to rise up from my sort of poor beginnings, and that was all under President Hugo Chavez. And she said, I have to have faith that Maduro's going to put the trousers on now and do what he needs to do to get the economy going and get this country working. So definitely two sides to this.
It's something that we will be looking forward to see if that happens, if he puts the trousers on. Thank you, John. Stay safe. We'll be watching your coverage. We'll continue our discussion on Venezuela with Emiliana Duarte. She's the managing editor at Caracas Chronicles, and George Chicarella-Mar is an author and associate professor of politics and global studies at Drexel University. Welcome to the stream, both of you. Now, as you heard from John, claims of fraud in the election from that company, Smartmatic, that makes the machines used to vote in Venezuela, rose just yesterday. They say turnout numbers have been bulked up by at least 1 million votes. So have a listen to our community member, Guillermo, on what he believes that means.
The recent acknowledgement by the software company Smartmatic that has been running the election softwares and machinery in Venezuela for the past 14 years is very troubling. The company says that the results were tampered with. I mean, any electoral fraud is troubling, but this one is particularly troubling because the purpose of this election is the rewriting of the Constitution, and it seems evident now by the software company, by reports, by the photos we saw on social media, that there was a very low participation. I think the region must come together and make sure that the Constitution is not rewritten because a small minority elected these people in a fraudulent election.
So, George, you hear what he said there. You tweeted this, though, on the 31st. The Venezuelan opposition is claiming that the tally of 8 million votes in yesterday's Constituent Assembly elections is simply made up, and those are the elections over the weekend. What do you think now?
I think it's entirely possible that there was fraud. It seems to me we need to be cautious with this. We need to start from the understanding of the fact that the CNE, the National Electoral Council, has a track record of clean elections, and the Venezuelan opposition has a 15-year track record of crying fraud when there has been no fraud. That's sort of the baseline understanding. Now, that doesn't mean there's no fraud in this case. It seems to me a strange moment for the CNE to spend its political credibility, in other words, simply bulking up numbers in an election that they were going to win anyway. And I wondered in another tweet why they would commit fraud now when they could have committed fraud in the National Assembly election that the Chavistas lost in 2015. And so these are all questions. Of course, this doesn't tell us what the answer is to what exactly happened. The numbers do seem high, although it's possible that many non-Chavistas turned out to vote as well. Maduro made this a vote against the violence in the streets, and many are openly opposed to that violence as well and are looking for a way out. But we also need to understand the actual statement from Smartmatic, from this company that made the machines, is a strange statement. Anyone that listens to it will hear that they talk about certainty that there was fraud, but then they also talk about lack of observers and other conditions as though that were a testament to the fraud. And the Venezuelan government, I don't know the answer to this, the Venezuelan government has said that Smartmatic doesn't have access to these numbers, and so it's unclear what they are talking about exactly. I think this is something we'll find out about. But the reality is, as soon as the opposition boycotted this vote for the Constituent Assembly, I think it raises the question of the political impact that this assembly can have, because the goal, of course, was to provide a way out of this stalemate in the institutions and a way for Venezuelans to come together and move forward.
So, George, you mentioned the boycott of the vote. Now, of course, coupled with that, really, on August 1st, we saw the arrest of 2 opposition leaders. This is a tweet that went out from the daughter of one of those leaders. Have a look at what happened. So, Emiliana, what do you make of this? Of course, these were arrests by intelligence services in the middle of the night. Now, George mentioned the boycott of the elections, but you could see why some people would say this is why those elections were boycotted. Emiliana?
Well, first of all, the reason why the opposition the opposition and the great majority of Venezuelans boycotted last Sunday's election is because from the beginning it was illegal, it was unconstitutional, it was illegitimate. There's nothing in our constitution that allows for the president to call for the constitution to be changed without the people first being consulted about it. Second of all, it wasn't just Smartmatic, the company that makes the voting machines, that has denounced fraud so far. One member of the 5-member National Electoral Council actually was not present deliberately on Sunday night when the results were announced, and later publicly said that he could not vouch for the veracity of those results. And there have also been reports from a recent Reuters report also claimed that it had internal documents from the CNE that put the voter tally on Sunday night at a much, much lower number. And then this is added to pictures and images in social media on Sunday showing evident voting emptiness in voting centers. As to the video that you just showed, which was of democratically elected Mayor Antonio Ledezma, who was violently dragged out of his home by the secret police in the middle of the night. He was serving house arrest on trumped-up charges, as was also Leopoldo Lopez, who was similarly treated in this fashion in the middle of the night. And it's just one more example of the disparity between the government's actions and its discourse. It claimed that this Constituent Assembly was supposed to be, the banner of unity and peace, and yet less than 24 hours after this vote happens, after this blank check was given by the regime to itself in order to consummate dictatorship, we wake up to these startling images of violence. The Foro Penal, who the journalist before this section cited, puts the number of political prisoners at almost 500. So human rights violations, coercion, the silencing of dissent, even former government loyalists that are now dissenters, like most notably the prosecutor general, who denounced yesterday that her children had been kidnapped, and she's getting death threats from government operatives.
So, Emiliana, it's stories like that is the reason we're seeing tweets like this. This is Laura Vidal of Global Voices, and she says, whatever side one might be on, it's impossible to let pass the human rights abuses committed by police and the military, allegations there, of course, that we've seen from other people. So what is the international community doing about this? So the United States, for one, has imposed sanctions on President Maduro. Telesur is not concerned. Trump is not the Venezuelan Supreme Court. That's their take on it. The Secretary of State of the United States, Rex Tillerson, however, has a different take. Have a listen to what he said.
We are evaluating all of our policy options as to what can we do to create a change of conditions where either Maduro decides he doesn't have a future and wants to leave of his own accord, or we can return the government processes back to their constitution.
George, what do you make of the sanctions, and will they actually change anything?
Well, I think the starting point for talking about any sanctions by the U.S. and by the Trump administration in particular is that Trump, of course, has no moral authority to say anything about anyone, much less the political process underway in Venezuela. Here's someone who himself is elected based on voter disenfranchisement of primarily people of color and who ran on an openly racist platform. And so I'm not sure why we would be concerned about this. Now, in terms of the strategic and practical question, this will backfire. It will, provide the Maduro government with more anti-imperialist credentials, because you've got not only the President of the United States, but this President of the United States attacking. And again, these sanctions were begun under Obama. This is not a new thing that the U.S. wants regime change, has wanted regime change for more than 15 years in Venezuela, and is simply trying to figure out the easiest way to accomplish this task. But I think it will backfire. I think it will only help to shore up what support Maduro has, and it will provide cover for the government moving forward.
Emiliana?
I think it's important not to single out the United States in its support of the Venezuelan people and the democratic cause. It's over 25 countries that have openly rejected the National Constituent Assembly vote on Sunday. Most of the region, save for a handful of countries that are still ideological allies of the Maduro regime, have released statements saying that they would support the individual sanctions that the United States has imposed on those who have violated human rights. Unfortunately, there is word of sectoral sanctions, threats of sectoral sanctions imposed on the Venezuelan oil company, which would doubtlessly throw Venezuela, which is already in 4-digit inflation, and the economy has Venezuelans mired in misery and hunger, into even deeper problems. But it's in the international community, in the most part, has basically just accompanied the Venezuelan people in their plight, to be able to express their will through free and fair elections, which these past elections were not.
So a question for both of you. We got this via Facebook from Jonathan. He says, where will the solution come from? Maduro's party and the opposition party both don't have any plan that could solve this crisis. So they'll probably roll back to another populist pledge full of promises, easy solutions, and miracles, same as before. George, do you want to take that on?
Sure. I mean, I think that's the real question. The Maduro government is not as popular as it was. We should be clear that Maduro is the legitimately elected president of the country who has a term to serve until 2018, when there will be new elections, that any constitutional reform coming out of this assembly will need to be approved by the majority. So we're, of course, not talking about dictatorship or anything. But the real question is really whether or not he and the government will come up with any kind of solution to the deep economic crisis. It's something that's been building for many years now, that's grounded heavily in a faulty exchange rate system and in long-term oil dependency by the Venezuelan state, and that the solutions have not been forthcoming, and this crisis has really spiraled out of control and become incredibly severe. And yet the opposition doesn't offer solutions either. It doesn't offer solutions on purpose because it doesn't want to lose popularity by pointing toward the fact that it will almost certainly engage in policies of economic austerity that harken back to the neoliberalism that's so discredited in Venezuela. And so it's really not clear where the solution will come from. And there are those who would say that the solution really needs to come from the grassroots level, this sector of Chavismo that is so often silenced in the international media, that wants change, that is very critical of the Maduro government, but that still supports this process as a process that has brought more and more people into political life in Venezuela and given them more control over the conditions of existence.
So grassroots, Emiliana, could that be what we see on Friday at these protests that are scheduled?
Well, there were actually grassroots Chavistas protesting yesterday before the National Electoral Council. Mind you, the electoral results of last Sunday have not yet been announced. We do not have access, nobody has access to the list of candidates that technically won last Sunday's election. And it's been 4 days since the elections happened. But I certainly think at the crux of this is the fact that the Maduro regime, which is a small ruling clique, holding a country of 30 million people hostage, have lost the majority of its support, and which is why ever since the National Assembly vote in 2015, which gave the opposition a mandate for change, the government, instead of addressing these grave economic problems and social issues, has everything it's done until now has been with the purpose of remaining in government to the detriment of the people they so say to champion.
Emiliana, George, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. I know there's more to talk about, and we'll get your thoughts on Twitter via #HJStream. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to keep a close eye on Venezuela, and we hope you'll come back to update us. Now, we move on to the silencing of Palestinian journalists.
Palestinian journalists often find themselves targeted by the Israeli police and the Palestinian Authority security forces operating in the occupied West Bank. One would expect restrictions and assaults against Palestinian journalists by the Israeli police as part of an occupation force. But what is disappointing is the media crackdown conducted by the PA security forces in the occupied West Bank and by Hamas in the Gaza Strip.
So is freedom of expression a casualty of fighting between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas? Some journalists say yes. Here to discuss violations against the press and the recent passage of the electronic media law in Jericho, Ashira Ramadan is regional researcher at Amnesty International. Thank you for joining us, Ashira. What is it like to be a reporter in the occupied West Bank or Gaza right now? What kinds of intimidation tactics are you hearing about?
We've been documenting cases of arrests and detention, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. there's been an increase, and especially in June, it has been one of the worst months for journalists since the beginning of 2017. We're also concerned about the bans of websites. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has banned 29 websites, which they deem critical to the PA. And we're also concerned about the new electronic crimes law, which was passed also in June. So the journalists are under a lot of pressure of intimidation. The Palestinian Preventative Security Forces in the West Bank have summoned several journalists for interrogation as part of their campaigns against these violations. And in Gaza, Hamas has also been summoning journalists and activists for interrogation.
Right. So, often in the news are headlines like this: Israeli army raids Palestinian TV station office in West Bank. That's from July 14th. This is a story and a narrative that the international community might be used to hearing. Not so much is what is happening in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. And so we heard from a journalist there who really is echoing some of what you said. Your research shows. This is Fadi, and this is what he told the stream.
We faced a lot of harassments in the last period by Palestinian Authority in West Bank and Hamas authorities in Gaza. A lot of journalists has been detained and arrested, in addition to the pressure on social media. And with the new law that has been approved by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, a lot of journalists will be under attack, and the freedom of speech will be limited so far.
So Ashira, he mentioned, and you mentioned earlier, this new cybercrime law. Here's a headline from Global Voices. Will Palestine's new cybercrime law pave the way for more rights violations? Can you break it down for us? What's so concerning about this law and why it might be different from what people thought it was going to be when they first heard about it?
One of the problems is that people didn't really hear about it. The civil society has shared their concerns with us and also with the Palestinian Authority that the law was passed in secrecy. A lot of secrecy was surrounding the law. None of the civil society organizations were consulted before the issuing of the law and the drafting of the law. It just came as a surprise that the law was passed in the way that it was passed. And once we got the chance to review the law, we found many gaps, and the main concerns are that this law is going to infringe on people's freedom of expression, right to the protection of privacy and data, and also it infringes on the right to assembly. Mm-hmm. And many of the clauses of the law contradict Palestine's obligations, international obligations. In 2014, the Palestinian Authority signed the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and many of the articles are in violation of that obligation. Right. And also it violates domestic Palestinian law. The Palestinian Basic Law protects journalists' right to work without restrictions. It protects the freedom of expression, and it protects the people's right to be critical.
So is this setting a precedent, do you think? I mean, clearly a dangerous one in your view because of how you're laying it out there, but is this a precedent for further intimidation and further narrowing of freedoms?
There's been already a campaign launched to try and freeze the law. The Palestinian civil society organizations have held meetings with the Palestinian Attorney General, as well as members of the Palestinian Liberation Organ, the PLO, in an attempt to freeze the law until further deliberations. Mm-hmm. And we've been hearing that a committee has been set up by the Prime Minister's office to discuss the current law and its current format.
That is a committee that we will keep our eye on and what happens and news lines from that. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us today. We have to leave it there for now, but we hope you'll keep us posted as things develop, and we know they will. We're at the end of today's program, but if you have a story you'd like to see us update, tweet us with #AJStream, and one of your pitches might make the next show. Until then, I'll see you online.